Welcome, dear listener, to this corner of the internet where family stories live, where the hurts and the healings of ordinary lives unfold in the way only families can. If these stories move you, if you see yourself or someone you love inside them, I hope you'll subscribe and stay with us. Every tale here is a reminder that family isn't just about blood. It's about the respect, the dignity, and sometimes the betrayals that shape us. And so tonight, I will begin with a story I once swore I would never tell. The title is simple enough, though its weight has sat on my chest for years. I was called a parasite at the family party. 30 minutes later, the whole town knew I owned their house. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old and I live in Denver, Colorado. Denver has its mountain views and its brisk air, but on that night, none of that beauty touched me. I was sitting at a long oak table in the very house where my father had raised me, a house now claimed by my stepmother, Gloria. It was early summer, the kind of evening when the sky doesn't fully darken until almost 9, and fireflies float against the window panes. The dining room was filled with cousins I barely recognized anymore, uncles already tipsy, and Gloria's friends, who had become louder, more colorful presences in this house than I had ever been allowed to be. I had been seated at the farthest end of the table, as though my presence were something to be tolerated but not celebrated. I was used to that position, though. Growing up, I was the quiet child, the one who drew in notebooks instead of making noise, the one who waited for my father's approval and rarely got it. Since he had passed 3 years earlier, that longing had only curdled into distance. Gloria had filled the space he left with her own rules, her own definitions of who mattered and who did not. She rose from her chair that night like a queen about to make a toast. The red dress she wore caught the chandelier light, glittering with sequins. Her glass of Chardonnay tilted casually in her manicured hand. People hushed. She was not a woman you ignored. Her eyes landed on me with that sharpness she always reserved for when an audience was present. "Emily," she said, her voice sweetened but pitched to carry across the table. "Maybe put that glass down, dear. You can't even afford the wine you're drinking." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the room. My fork stopped midair. The word that followed lodged in my chest like a splinter. Parasite. "You're nothing but a parasite," she continued, her tone the same one you might use when swatting away a fly. "Living off roofs you don't own, meals you don't pay for. Some of us know what it means to work for our place at this table. Others..." She let the words trail, leaving the rest implied, the silence almost more cruel than the statement. I felt my face heat. Around me, no one moved. A cousin lowered his eyes. An aunt coughed as if to clear the air. Even my father's photograph on the mantel, caught in its wooden frame, seemed to look down in judgment or maybe apology. I wanted to speak, but years of swallowing words had trained me too well. So instead, I did what I had learned to do. I smiled. Not the smile of surrender, but the smile of someone holding a secret. Because here is the truth Gloria didn't know. 2 weeks earlier, the deed to that very house, the one whose walls were echoing with her laughter and her cruelty, had been transferred into my name. My father, who had seemed so cold, had left arrangements through a trust. It was delayed, hidden until the paperwork cleared, but once it did, I, the so-called parasite, became the legal owner of every beam and brick of the Carter family home. So as Gloria raised her glass higher, toasting, family, and all of us who know our worth, I reached quietly for my phone beneath the table. My thumb moved with a steadiness I didn't feel inside. In my messages, I found the realtor's thread and typed 3 words, "Cancel everything." Immediately, I pressed send. The phone buzzed once as though acknowledging the shift. I slid it back into place and lifted my own glass to my lips. I tasted bitterness, not from the wine, but from the memory of every time Gloria had dismissed me, every time she had called me ungrateful, lazy, or invisible. And now she had chosen the word parasite, a word meant to stick to me like a label I could never peel away. But here's the strange thing about words. They can wound, but they can also backfire. It took less than 30 minutes. The whispers began with a cousin who had overheard a phone call from the realtor, confused why a pending sale was suddenly pulled at the request of the property owner, me. Word spread like sparks in dry grass. At first, the guests thought it was a mistake. Then the murmurs turned into pointed glances. Eyes shifted from Gloria's proud stance to my calm silence. Gloria's lipstick, so bold, seemed to falter as if the red itself were bleeding beyond the lines. "Surely this is some error," she tried to say, but the air had changed. I leaned back in my chair, no words necessary, because the house, in its way, had begun speaking for me. Every polished banister, every window that faced the yard, every brick in the fireplace, they all now belonged to me. And though I hadn't uttered a defense, my ownership spoke louder than her insult. For the first time in years, I watched the faces of my family shift. They no longer saw me as the leftover daughter, the quiet one in the shadows, the burden at the table. They saw me as someone they had underestimated, someone who had chosen silence not out of weakness but out of strength. Gloria remained standing, glass trembling ever so slightly in her hand. Around her, the guests no longer laughed. The silence had turned thick, heavy, undeniable. I did not gloat. I did not shout. I simply breathed. And in that breath, I realized something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Respect is not won by cruelty, nor by inheritance of blood. It is reclaimed, sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once, in the moment when the truth finally comes to light. That was the night I was called a parasite. And that was the night everyone in that room, and soon the entire town, learned whose roof they were standing under. The silence after Gloria's toast hung in the room like a storm cloud that refused to break. I remember the way her friends shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their smiles faltering, the false sparkle in their eyes dimming as the weight of the whispers thickened. I sat very still, my hand resting on the stem of the wine glass she swore I could never afford, and for once in my life, I didn't rush to shrink into the wallpaper. I let the silence stretch. It was my cousin Sarah who leaned in first, her voice a hushed curiosity meant only for the person beside her, but carried further in the tense air. "Wait," she murmured. "Did you hear what the realtor said? She owns it. Emily owns the house." That sentence unraveled the fabric of the evening faster than Gloria's rehearsed laugh could sew it back together. I felt eyes land on me like spotlights. Forks clinked softly against porcelain as people lost interest in their plates, and found it impossible to look away from the woman at the far end of the table. The woman they had all thought expendable. I could have spoken then. I could have announced the truth myself, declared to Gloria in front of them all that the deed, the trust, the legacy of this place no longer belonged to her pretense but to me. But I didn't. Instead, I lifted the wine glass to my lips, held it a moment longer than necessary, and drank. The action was simple, but it said everything. Gloria's face tightened. She set down her glass a little too hard, the sound sharp against the wood. "Rumors," she said, smiling again though her lipstick trembled. "This family thrives on nonsense, don't we, Emily?" Her tone was sharp enough to cut, but for the first time it failed to pierce me. I held her gaze across the length of the table. I saw the flicker in her eyes, the awareness, however faint, that her grip was loosening. It was Uncle Henry, already unsteady from the beers he had been nursing, who tipped the balance. "So it's true, then." He slurred, his finger jabbing toward me. "The house, this house, it's hers." A ripple of shock moved around the table. I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I simply rested my hand on the tablecloth, my father's ring passed to me quietly years before catching the light. That ring had never meant much when it sat in my jewelry box, but in that moment, with half the family staring at it, it spoke louder than a notarized document. Gloria's laughter came again, brittle and hollow. "Oh, please, she's always been dramatic. Don't indulge her." But her voice betrayed her just slightly, quivering like a wire under too much strain. Someone coughed. A chair scraped. The air grew thick with a question nobody dared ask aloud. If Emily owned the house, what did that mean for all of them sitting in it, eating at her table, drinking her wine? I could see the calculations playing out on their faces. The cousins who once dismissed me began to sit straighter, eyes softer, as if to rewrite history in a heartbeat. My aunts suddenly remembered how close they had once been to my mother, long gone but still living in the walls. It was absurd and a little cruel how quickly allegiance shifted when power revealed itself. I didn't relish it, not really, but I also didn't stop it. Because for 32 years I had been the afterthought, the girl shuffled aside, the stepdaughter spoken about rather than spoken to. And on that warm Colorado evening, with fireflies winking against the glass and Gloria clutching her wineglass as though it were a scepter slipping from her hand, I realized the balance had shifted. Gloria leaned closer to her circle of friends, lowering her voice but not enough to escape me. "She'll never manage it," she hissed. "She doesn't have the spine. Houses are work and she's never." Her words dissolved into the murmurs around her. And that was when I felt it, not triumph, not vengeance, but something heavier, something almost tender. It was the memory of my father, his quiet presence, his silence that had so often felt like rejection. Maybe he hadn't spoken love easily. Maybe he had let Gloria fill the space with her sharp tongue and bright dresses. But he had left this house to me, in trust, in permanence. He had spoken in the language of deeds and documents instead of birthday wishes, and though it had taken years for me to understand, I was beginning to hear him. I folded my napkin, placed it neatly by my plate, and rose. The chatter softened instantly. Dozens of eyes followed me as I walked the length of the table, past cousins who had once laughed at Gloria's jokes about me, past uncles who never defended me, past the empty chair where my father once sat. I stopped at Gloria's end. She looked up, her smile brittle as glass. "Leaving already?" she said, voice dripping disdain. I met her eyes, and for once I didn't lower mine. "I'm not leaving," I said softly, letting the words land like stones in a still pond. "I'm just choosing where I sit." And with that, I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the chair my father once occupied, and I sat down. No one breathed. The house, for a moment, seemed to inhale with me. Gloria's hand twitched around her glass. She wanted to laugh, to belittle, to dismiss. But the words wouldn't come. Behind me, the fireflies flickered. Around me, my family's silence spoke louder than applause. And deep inside, for the first time, I felt the faintest whisper of something I thought I'd lost forever. Belonging. The chair beneath me felt heavier than I expected, as though its wood carried not just my weight but the weight of years, of dinners I had been excluded from, of conversations that had hushed when I entered a room, of every small humiliation that had been written off as just family. Now, here I was, at the head of the table, the seat that once belonged to my father. A fork clattered near the middle of the table. My cousin Michael, always the blunt one, cleared his throat. "So, is it true? Do you really own this house?" The question cracked the silence like thunder. All eyes turned toward me, some curious, some doubtful, a few almost desperate, as if my answer would rewrite their own security. I didn't rush. I traced the rim of the glass in front of me with my fingertip, feeling the fine vibration hum against my skin. Then I reached for my purse, resting quietly by my chair, and pulled out a thin manila envelope. It wasn't dramatic. I hadn't planned this moment as some grand unveiling. But I had carried the papers with me ever since the trust had been finalized, partly for safety, partly because I still didn't believe it myself. I placed the envelope on the table, slid it forward. The word deed was typed neatly across the top document, the county's seal stamped at the bottom. A murmur rippled down the table. Chairs shifted. Someone gasped. Gloria's hand shot out before anyone else could touch it. She snatched the envelope, flipping through the pages with shaking fingers, her red nails scratching against the paper as though she could claw the truth away. The deeper she read, the paler she became. Her voice faltered. This isn't right. He would never. But the words betrayed her. She knew as well as I did. My father had signed every line, left every instruction. His lawyer had confirmed it. The house that Gloria had lorded over, the house she had decorated with her taste and filled with her friends, was mine. Uncle Henry leaned forward, squinting at the paper from across the table. "The seal's real," he muttered. "That's the county clerk's mark." The cousins whispered among themselves. Some leaned back, suddenly uneasy. Others tilted toward me as though proximity to ownership meant proximity to power. I stayed quiet. I didn't need to narrate what the papers already shouted. Gloria slammed the envelope shut and shoved it back toward me, her face flushed. "This doesn't change who you are," she snapped, voice cracking under its own strain. "Paper doesn't make you family, it doesn't make you worthy." I felt my heart steady, a calm I had never known rising inside me. "No," I said, keeping my voice even, "but neither does cruelty." Her mouth opened, then closed. For once, Gloria had no retort. Behind her, the framed photo of my father seemed to glow a little in the chandelier's light. His half-smile, the one I had once mistaken for indifference, looked different now. I wondered if he had known this moment would come, if he had written the deed not only to secure my future, but to give me a seat at the table he had never let me take while he was alive. The guests avoided Gloria's eyes. Some of them stared at me with something close to respect. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, and that was more than I had ever been given. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply gathered the papers back into their envelope and set it beside me, the way one might place a keepsake, not a weapon. And then I lifted my glass again, took a slow sip, and let the wine settle on my tongue. The truth was out. The power had shifted. But more than that, something deeper had begun to change inside me. For the first time in years, I felt like my father's silence had broken, and it had spoken through me. When the party finally broke apart, the air outside carried that faint summer chill that always sneaks into Denver evenings, no matter how warm the day has been. People drifted onto the porch in clusters, clutching their drinks as if alcohol could steady what had just tilted inside. It started with Sarah, my cousin, who couldn't keep anything to herself for long. She pulled out her phone on the porch steps, thumbs tapping fast. Her best friend lived across the street, and within minutes, the message was out. Emily owns the Carter house. By the time I stepped into the yard, fireflies dotting the darkness like sparks of gossip themselves, I could feel the shift. Neighbors who had been invited mostly for appearances were whispering behind cupped hands. Cars pulled out of the driveway, headlights cutting through the night, but not before windows rolled down and voices traded hurried sentences. It was as if the deed itself had sprouted wings, flying from mouth to mouth, block to block. I stood by the old oak tree at the edge of the lawn, the same tree I used to climb as a child when I wanted to escape the noise of the house. I could hear the voices floating back. "Did you hear? Not Gloria, Emily. Emily owns it." Gloria stormed through the crowd, her heels stabbing the grass with each step. She tried to laugh it off, tossing her hair, calling it a misunderstanding. But the laughter rang false, brittle as cracked glass. The more she denied, the more people seemed to believe. And then came the moment that sealed it. Mr. Jacobs, the neighbor who had lived next door since before I was born, shuffled up with his cane. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but his voice carried when he wanted it to. "So it's you then, Emily?" he asked, peering at me with pale blue eyes. "You're the new owner." I nodded softly. "Well," he said, tapping his cane once against the ground, "about time this house belonged to a Carter again." The word spread faster than any denial Gloria could muster. About time. About time. People repeated it like a hymn as they left the yard, taking the story with them, weaving it into their good nights and their drives home. By the next morning, I couldn't walk into the corner cafe without feeling the eyes. The barista, who had served me lattes without ever bothering to remember my name, smiled suddenly and said, "Good morning, Miss Carter." Not Emily, Miss Carter, as if my surname had only just returned to me with the deed. At the grocery store, whispers followed me down the aisle. "That's her," someone said near the produce section. "That's the one who owns the Carter place now. Did you hear what happened at the party?" It was as if my father's house had become a stage and Gloria's insult had become the opening act to a play everyone wanted to watch. I didn't ask for it. I didn't crave the spectacle. But I won't lie, a part of me savored it, the quiet vindication of watching the same people who once overlooked me scramble to rewrite the way they spoke my name. That night, when I returned to the house, the yard was empty, the laughter gone, only the crickets singing. The windows glowed softly from within, and for the first time since I could remember, the house didn't feel like a stranger to me. It felt like it had been waiting for me to claim it, to stand in its light, to walk its halls without apology. I stepped inside, the door closing with a solid click behind me. Gloria was nowhere to be seen. She had retreated to her room upstairs, her empire crumbling into silence. I placed the envelope with the deed on the mantel, just beneath my father's photograph. "Dad," I whispered, the word foreign and fragile in my mouth. "They know now." And though the room was still, I could swear the house itself exhaled, as if relieved, as if it had been carrying a secret too long. That night, I didn't sleep. I wandered the halls instead, barefoot on the hardwood floors, the ones that creaked in familiar places like old friends remembering secrets. Every corner of the house was heavy with memory. The banister I once slid down as a girl, the back door where my father used to stand with his coffee at sunrise, the kitchen table where silence stretched longer than any blessing before a meal. For years, I thought that silence meant something ugly. I thought it meant disinterest or disappointment, or worse, shame. My father was never a man of words, and I carried the absence of them like a wound. I told myself he didn't care, that maybe he loved Gloria's laughter more than my quiet presence, that maybe I was invisible even in my own home. But as I moved through the rooms that night, I began to see him differently. The study still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, though he hadn't touched it for years before he passed. His chair, worn in the same place where his hand always rested, faced the desk with neat stacks of papers. I remembered how I used to peek inside as a girl, hoping to find something, anything, that proved he thought of me when I wasn't around. Back then, I never found it. Now, the deed itself lay waiting on the mantel, his final word, not spoken but signed. Not a sentence, but an action. It was as if he had been speaking all along, just in a language I hadn't learned yet. I sat in his chair, the leather cool against my skin. I closed my eyes and let the silence wrap around me, but it didn't sting the way it used to. For the first time, the silence felt like presence instead of absence. I remembered small things then, things I had buried. The way he would warm up the car on freezing mornings before I left for school, though he never said a word about it. The way he'd leave a folded blanket on the couch when I stayed up too late with my books. The way his shadow lingered in the doorway of my room some nights, quiet, watching before slipping away. He had loved me in his own muted way. I just hadn't known how to hear it. A lump formed in my throat. I whispered into the dim light of the study, "Why didn't you just tell me?" My voice cracked. One time, just once. No answer came, of course. Only the hum of the refrigerator in the distance, the steady tick of the old clock on the wall. Yet somehow, I felt as though the house itself was answering, telling me that love doesn't always arrive wrapped in words. Sometimes it arrives in the steadiness of a roof overhead, in the warmth of heat that clicks on in the middle of winter, in a deed signed and sealed long before anyone else could claim it. I pressed my palm against the desk. Against the wood my father's hands had worn smooth. And for the first time since his funeral, the funeral I hadn't attended, I let myself cry for him. The tears were not just for the years I had believed I was unloved, but for the realization that I had been wrong. That his silence, however flawed, had been filled with a love too clumsy to speak but too stubborn to die. When the sobs quieted, I stood and walked back to the mantel. His photograph watched me, that half smile on his face. For years I had hated that smile, mistaking it for smugness or distance. Tonight I saw something else, restraint, as if he had always been holding back more than he knew how to say. "I hear you now," I whispered. And in that moment, I knew the house was not just a home. It was a message. A father's final way of telling his daughter she had never been a parasite. She had always belonged. Morning arrived with a gray sky, heavy with clouds, as if the weather itself sensed the weight hanging inside the house. I brewed coffee in the kitchen, the same percolator my father once used, and sat at the island with the manila envelope resting beside me. The papers no longer felt like armor. They felt like inheritance, like truth finally revealed. I heard Gloria before I saw her, the sharp rhythm of her heels striking the floor upstairs, the irritated shuffle of drawers opening and closing. When she appeared in the doorway, she looked less like a queen and more like a dethroned ruler, her red lipstick smudged, her hair unbrushed, still wearing the dress from the night before. She didn't greet me. She simply marched to the refrigerator, yanked it open, and pulled out a bottle of mineral water. The slam of the door echoed louder than it should have. "You think one piece of paper changes everything," she said finally, twisting the cap. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't slept. "You think owning these walls makes you stronger than me?" I didn't flinch. I let her words hang in the air, tasting the bitterness in them. "It's not about stronger," I said quietly. "It's about truth." Gloria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Truth, please, you've been invisible your whole life. Your father hardly looked at you. You were nothing to him, Emily, nothing." The words sliced, but they no longer bled me the way they once would have. I met her eyes, steady. "If I was nothing, why did he leave it all to me?" Her grip on the bottle tightened, the plastic crackling under her fingers. For a moment, I thought she might throw it across the room. Instead, she set it down with deliberate slowness. "You stole him from me," she hissed. "Even now, you steal." I shook my head. "No, Gloria, I didn't steal anything. He chose. And you can't forgive him for choosing me, even after he's gone." Her face twisted, anger and something else, fear maybe, flashing in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she turned sharply, storming toward the staircase. Halfway up, she paused, her hand gripping the railing. Without looking back, she said, "This isn't over." And then she disappeared into the shadows of the upstairs hallway, leaving the house quiet again. I sat there at the kitchen island, the coffee cooling in front of me, the deed resting beneath my hand. My pulse steadied, a calm rising in me that surprised even myself. For years, Gloria's voice had been the loudest in my life, drowning out every other truth. But now I realized her words had lost their power. For the first time, I didn't feel like the stepdaughter hiding in corners. I felt like the woman who belonged here. I stood, carried the envelope back to the mantel, and placed it beneath my father's photograph once more. His eyes seemed to follow me, not cold, not distant, just present. "This isn't over," Gloria had said, and maybe she was right. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The days that followed were filled with whispers, not the kind that died in corners, but the kind that spread like smoke through every hallway, every phone call, every coffee shop table in town. Gloria had always been a master of performance, and she wasted no time staging her next act. It started with the cousins. Sarah texted me late one evening. She's saying you tricked him, that you manipulated Dad when he was sick. My stomach tightened as I read the words. I could almost hear Gloria's voice, smooth as velvet and sharp as glass, rehearsing her story until even she believed it. By the weekend, the rumors had grown teeth. At the grocery store, a woman who had known me since grade school pulled her cart tighter against her side as I passed, whispering to the friend beside her. I caught fragments, forged papers, took advantage, and felt the sting all over again, the same sting I had felt as a child when playground taunts stuck to my skin. One night, sitting alone in the living room, I scrolled through social media and saw the words typed out for everyone to read. Not surprised. Always thought Emily was greedy, like stepmother, like daughter. I closed the app and set the phone down, but the ache stayed. Gloria, meanwhile, played her part flawlessly. She attended church in her finest clothes, her hands folded, her face painted with grief. She cried in the pews, spoke softly to anyone who would listen, telling them how hard it was to lose both a husband and now, in essence, a home. She painted herself as the widow discarded, the woman wronged by a stepdaughter too hungry for power. People wanted to believe her. It was easier than facing the truth of who she really was. One afternoon, I stepped out onto the porch and found a letter pinned beneath the doormat. No return address, just scrawled words on notebook paper. You don't belong in that house. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but the message was clear. I stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling in my hand, before finally crumpling it into my pocket. Inside, the house felt quieter than ever. The walls didn't echo with laughter anymore. Gloria's absence had drained them of noise. Yet even in silence, I felt the pressure of her presence. She was still here, not in body but in whispers, in the suspicion she sowed, in the doubt she planted like weeds. That evening, I sat at the mantel again, staring at my father's photograph. "Why me?" I whispered. "Why did you give this to me if you knew she would never let me keep it in peace?" The photograph didn't answer, but the deed beneath it did. His choice was there in black and white. He had known what Gloria was capable of. He had known her bitterness, her hunger for control, and still he chose me. It wasn't about the house. It was about the line he wanted drawn. I poured myself a glass of water, the reflection trembling against the surface, and whispered, "She thinks this isn't over. Maybe it isn't, but this time I won't run." The words surprised me, their strength unfamiliar. For years, I had been the quiet one, the girl who swallowed her voice, the woman who walked away from her father's funeral rather than confront what she felt. But sitting in that living room, Gloria's lies swirling beyond the walls, I realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about surviving her anymore. It was about reclaiming myself. The letter under the doormat was only the beginning. By the next week, I received a notice in the mail, formal, crisp, printed on the kind of letterhead that carries weight. It was from Gloria's lawyer. She was challenging the trust. The words on the page blurred as I read them. Unfit beneficiary, questionable competency, undue influence. In plain English, Gloria was trying to paint me as someone who had manipulated a dying man into giving me what wasn't mine. I sat at the kitchen table with the notice trembling in my hands, the house eerily quiet around me. The weight of it pressed into my chest. I thought of my father's final years, his silence, his tired eyes, and wondered if the world would believe her version over mine. She had always been better at speaking, better at performing. I had always been the quiet one, the one who slipped into corners rather than step into the light. By evening, the whispers in town had grown sharper. At the coffee shop, two women leaned across their lattes, their voices carrying without shame. "Did you hear? She's being sued. Stole the house from poor Gloria." One of them glanced at me as if I were a stranger, not the girl they'd seen grow up on these very streets. At the grocery store, Mr. Jacobs, who had once declared it was about time a Carter owned the place again, looked uneasy now, his faith shaken by the rumors. "I don't know what's true anymore," he muttered when I passed, not meeting my eyes. I went home that night feeling the walls close in. For the first time, the house felt less like a refuge and more like a battleground. Gloria's absence echoed in every room, but her presence lingered in the gossip, in the papers filed at the courthouse, in the looks of neighbors who had already decided who was guilty. I sat at my father's old desk, the deed spread out before me. My fingers traced the seal, the signature, the lines of ink that were more than words. They were his choice. And I realized then that this wasn't just about ownership. It wasn't about bricks or walls. It was about dignity. For years, I had let Gloria define me. She had called me weak, invisible, a parasite. And every time, I had swallowed the insult, believing that silence was survival. But silence had also been surrender. Now, her lawsuit was forcing me into a choice: keep hiding or finally step forward. The next morning, I drove downtown to meet with a lawyer of my own. I wore a simple navy dress, my father's ring on my finger. I expected the lawyer to look at me with doubt, maybe pity. Instead, after reading the papers, he looked up and said, "You have a strong case, stronger than hers. If you want to fight this, we'll win." His confidence startled me. For the first time, someone outside of myself believed in me, not in spite of Gloria's shadow, but because the truth itself was strong enough. When I left the office, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. I stood on the courthouse steps, the city buzzing around me, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: steadiness. Gloria could spread her stories. She could file her lawsuits. She could parade her grief like a crown. But I had something she didn't: my father's choice and the strength to finally defend it. That night, I placed the legal notice beneath the mantle, right beside the deed. Let them sit together, the challenge and the truth, side by side. One was paper filled with venom. The other was paper filled with love. And for the first time, I knew which one would last. The courthouse smelled of old wood and polished stone, the kind of place where lives were reshaped with the stroke of a pen. I had never imagined standing there as anything more than a bystander. But on that Tuesday morning, my name was on the docket. Carter v.S. Carter. Even seeing it typed on the schedule board outside the courtroom made my chest ache. Inside, Gloria was already seated at the plaintiff's table, her hair pinned into a careful bun, her black dress tailored to perfection. She looked every bit the grieving widow, her hands folded like a woman clutching rosary beads. When she glanced at me, her eyes didn't just glare, they sliced. I took my seat beside my lawyer, palms damp against the wooden table. Behind us, the benches creaked as family members filed in. Some avoided my eyes, others looked at me with a mixture of doubt and pity. It was like reliving every childhood gathering, except now the stakes were carved into legal briefs and affidavits. The judge entered, his gavel striking once, and the proceedings began. Gloria's lawyer stood tall, his voice polished, rehearsed. He painted me as the stepdaughter who had taken advantage of a dying man's confusion, manipulating him into transferring a home that never should have left his wife's possession. He spoke of influence and greed, his words rolling across the courtroom like heavy stones. I stared at the table as he spoke, my jaw tight. Every insult felt like an echo of the words Gloria had thrown at me for years. Parasite, useless, invisible. Then it was our turn. My lawyer rose, calm and measured. He laid out the facts. The trust signed years before my father's illness, the notarized documents, the independent witnesses who confirmed his clarity of mind. It was dry, legal language, but each piece was like a brick laid firmly in place. And then came the surprise. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, "we'd like to call a witness, Mr. Jacobs." I turned, startled. There he was, the neighbor from next door, leaning heavily on his cane, his pale blue eyes steady. He made his way slowly to the stand, every step deliberate. When sworn in, his voice carried with surprising strength. "I lived beside the Carters for 40 years, he began. I knew Emily's father better than most. He was a quiet man, but he wasn't confused. 2 years before he passed, he told me directly what he was doing. said he was leaving the house to Emily because she was the one who'd understand it best. He said, "Gloria will never love these walls the way Emily does." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I felt the air leave my lungs. Gloria's face twisted, her lips parting as if to object, but the judge silenced her with a look. "Mr. Jacobs went on. I didn't say anything at the time, figured it wasn't my business. But when I heard the lies being spread, I couldn't stay quiet. The truth is, he wanted Emily to have this place. That was his choice, and anyone who knew him knew he meant what he said. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. I blinked hard, fighting back the sting in my eyes. For so long, I had carried the weight of doubt, the ache of wondering if my father's choice was real, if his love had ever been more than silence. And here was a neighbor, a man who had lived in the shadows of our family drama, giving voice to what I had needed to hear all along. When court recessed for lunch, I stepped outside into the cool air, my hands still trembling. Mr. Jacobs shuffled over, resting a hand lightly on my arm. "You're stronger than you think, child," he said. "Don't let her steal your father from you a second time." I nodded, words caught in my throat. He smiled faintly, then turned back toward his car. And for the first time since this battle began, I didn't feel alone. The second half of the hearing moved faster than the first, though to me, every minute felt stretched thin, like glass about to crack. The judge listened carefully, his glasses sliding low on his nose, his pen scratching across notes as each witness spoke. Our side presented documents. The trust dated, notarized, signed in full health years before my father's decline. The witnesses affirmed his clarity of mind. The lawyer who drafted it testified to his intentions. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself into a picture that couldn't be ignored. Gloria sat rigid, her hands folded tight in her lap. Her lawyer tried once more to stir doubt, to paint me as a manipulator, to claim my father was weak, easily led. But each argument seemed thinner than the last, stretched past breaking. When it was over, the judge set down his pen and removed his glasses. The entire courtroom held its breath. "The court finds," he began, his voice even, "that the trust in question is valid and that the transfer of the property to MS, Emily Carter, is legally binding. The challenge presented by the plaintiff is hereby dismissed." The gavel struck once. A single sound, final as thunder. It was over. The words landed in me slowly, like rain soaking into parched earth. For weeks, I had carried the weight of Gloria's accusations, the stares of neighbors, the doubt of family. Now, with one ruling, the truth had been set down in ink, no longer a matter of whispers but of record. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My lawyer gave me a nod, small, professional, but warm enough to steady me. Behind me, I heard someone clap softly, then another. It wasn't applause, not really, but it was recognition. Gloria didn't move. She sat there, frozen, her lipstick cracking at the corners, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as though they were the last rails of a sinking ship. When the judge left, the room stirred with motion. Papers gathered, benches scraped. But she remained, staring straight ahead, unblinking. I stood. The envelope with the deed felt heavier than ever in my hand, not because of its paper, but because of what it meant. It wasn't just proof of ownership. It was proof of choice. My father's choice. As I walked toward the door, Gloria finally looked at me. For a heartbeat, I saw something I had never seen in her eyes before. Not anger, not disdain, but fear. The performance was over, and all that remained was the truth she couldn't erase. Outside, the autumn sun broke through the clouds. Reporters milled about the steps. Neighbors stood gathered in little knots of conversation, their voices carrying the story further into the town. I descended the steps slowly, each footfall grounding me in a reality I had never dared hope for. I had won. Not just the house, not just the case, but a part of myself I had thought lost. That evening, back at the house, I lit a single lamp in the living room. The deed lay on the mantel beneath my father's photograph, steady as stone. The silence inside the house was no longer heavy. It felt lighter, freer, as if the walls, themselves, had been waiting for this moment to breathe again. I sat in his chair, hands folded in my lap, and whispered into the quiet. "It's settled, Dad. You gave me this, and I finally understand why." The house didn't answer, but for the first time I didn't need it to. The house was quiet in a way that felt like a soft exhale. Sunlight filtered through the windows, falling across the hardwood floors in warm, golden patches. I moved slowly from room to room, my fingers brushing against the walls, the mantel, the furniture that had belonged to my father. Every corner carried a memory, every shadow a whisper of him. Sitting in the living room that evening, I pulled out the box of letters he had left behind. 17 envelopes, one for each birthday he had marked in secret. Each one carefully folded, each one filled with words that revealed what I had never dared hope for: his love, his pride, his unwavering faith in me. I read them slowly, savoring each line, feeling the pulse of his presence in every sentence. There were stories, small jokes, memories of us together, reminders that no matter what had happened between my father and me, or the world, I was never truly alone. It was then that I understood the quiet power of his love. It wasn't loud or showy. It didn't demand recognition, but it was steadfast, patient, and enduring, and now it was my turn to honor it. I started writing a letter back, a promise to carry forward his legacy, not just of ownership or inheritance, but of care, resilience, and respect. A promise to live a life that would make him proud, in ways that went beyond property or money, in ways that mattered to the heart. Later that evening, as I stood on the balcony looking over the yard, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The house was no longer a battleground. It was home, and more importantly, it was a reminder that even when love is hidden, it can shape your life in ways that words alone cannot describe. I realized that family, true family, is not just about presence or absence, conflict or silence. It is about the love that endures, quietly waiting to be understood, and I finally understood it. To everyone watching this story, I want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing in this journey, for letting these moments of heartbreak and revelation resonate with you. I hope it reminds you to cherish your own family, to speak your love, and to honor those small, quiet gestures that often mean more than grand declarations. May your hearts be full, your homes be warm, and your families be safe and happy. Remember to hold onto the people you love and never underestimate the power of silent devotion. From my heart to yours, thank you, and may you all find the courage, the love, and the peace that I was lucky enough to discover.